Welcome to Millie Salmon and the Book of Habits. This is Chapter 2, Work Schedule and Attendance. In this episode, Millie's work at the shop becomes routine, or as routine as it can be working inside an interstellar ship whose computer is a little unpredictable. I'm the author, Ray Dubicki, and I'm very happy to be reading Millie's adventures for you. You can join Millie Salmon on Patreon, or find more at milliesalmon.com. You can follow this podcast and more on social media at Infinite Shop Limited. Chapter 2, Work Schedule and Attendance. Employees of Second Story Books will adhere to the work schedule that is posted at least 2 standard weeks in advance. Staff will inform management of potential absences, potential early leaving, and potential energy. Paid leave, unpaid leave, and autumn leaves will be distributed in accordance with the Book of Habits. This document is governed by the jurisdiction with employment rules that best construe the meaning of the following short poem. Enter the home, the hoop, the harp. Turneth out the pant leg. 1 cup arrowroot, 2 parts mega gin. The dissonant stereo is a strobe. Beach, they scream, and the elephant is no more. After a weekend of running around with Reggie and Pats, and a Monday spent reading in the park, Millie returned to the shop for her second week of work as acolyte. Quibby, welcome back for round 2. How was your weekend?
Grandpa, you saw me at Sunday dinner.
I'm well aware of that, Quibby, but office protocol takes over, and we ask each other how the weekend went the first time we see them after the weekend. If we don't stick to the rules, we end up like Kinade Allant. It was still early on her first day back in the shop after the weekend. It felt like this standard grandpa story was coming at her fast and furious. Millie wasn't sure if she wanted to know, so she left her fate to chance. Or the very small chance Grandpa didn't want to tell a story. Should I ask? Please do.
What is Kinade Allant?
Oh, it's a planet. Nice folks, very long fingers, who make a commanding helicose pie. But their issue started on Kinade Depult, one of the 8 gas giant planets in the Kinade system. It accreted so much mass so quickly that it shot straight past erupting into a binary star and instead collapsed into a black hole.
And that was the result of someone not following office rules?
The singularity? Not at all. All the accretion was because someone flushed a paper towel down the commode. However, Kinade Allant was not able to get its magnetosphere boosted in time to protect it from both sides. When the shock wave of the collapsing planet struck, the panicked shield operators hit the wrong button and quadrisected the poles. Instead of just north and south poles, they added an east and west, and now the planet rotates in a figure 8.
Millie did not enjoy the feeling this image put in her brain. The whole planet sort of puckering inward like it had sucked on a lemon. Then its lips emerging out the back. She shuddered and was only able to emit a weak, "Okay, rules good." That didn't sound right, but Grandpa didn't offer any relief. Instead, he smiled, gave a little nod, and pulled out the big book of tasks. They flipped through the binder to the current day's list of odd jobs to do around the shop. Millie was sent outside to sweep the sidewalk and wipe off the windows on Apollyon New. Rules good, just didn't fit with anything she knew of Grandpa, the shop, or even her parents. She spent the time rolling the statement around in her head, unsatisfied. After her shift ended at the shop, Millie checked in with Dad at home. She didn't even stop to take off her shoes on a quick lap through the kitchen, but was able to deposit empty lunchbox and pick up 3 different snacks on her way back out the door. Dad told an empty room to have a good time and went back to combining recipes from 3 different cookbooks into the bubbling pot currently on the stove. Pats joined Millie on the sidewalk, both getting up to full speed walking to Room and Board, the neighborhood game shop. His strides were lengthening as he stopped being the shortest person in their class about halfway through last year. Millie now stood at Pat's shoulder, but she made up for it with determination, and their quick pace matched their excitement to not be at work. There were no organized tournaments or after-school clubs over the summer because the game shop had kids in it during the day for summer camps. So the afternoon was free for the trio to choose a game and not be interrupted by league play. When they arrived, they saw Reggie had already claimed a table with his trash can-sized fluorescent pink slushie. He was looking down the wall of games behind the counter, deciding what they would be playing. "How cooperative are you feeling?" asked Boots, the game store clerk. He was an orange-haired, very wiry guy that had been away at college for the winter. He looked exactly the same as when he left at the end of last summer, except that he now had a tattoo that said Pendragon in black Gothic letters on his forearm. Given how thin Boots was, the letters could have said Ticonderoga because they looked written on a pencil. "I want to crush my enemies," Reggie said, fully knowing that his 2 friends had walked in. "I want to hear their despair as they are driven into the ground, curdling howls emanating from the deepest of graves as my forces pile more and more corpses atop them to muffle their screams." Boots really didn't care, and handed Reggie a box for the game Dante's Diner. It was the size of a printer and weighed as much as their backpacks. This pleased Pats endlessly, given he loved the game and seeing Reggie crushed under the massive box. The game was not difficult in any way. It just involved a lot of moving pieces. Thus the enormous box. There was something close to 500 cards and just as many tiles, forcing the players to switch between building a layout of a restaurant in hell, then flipping cards to feed the ever-growing number of monsters, demons, ghosts, rotten beasts, demigods, and varied cursed souls who showed up hungry but never would be satisfied. Really, it was an excuse to drop ever more powerful switch cards on your opponents. The Sure Take My Place card was a popular late-game card that allowed a player with 50 or more cards to switch with another. That usually ended the game when the cards were thrown, usually by Reggie at Pat's when Reggie lost. Again, Pat's loved this game. The only person that loved Dante's Diner more than Pat's was Reggie. Even though he lost fairly frequently and often in the most furious way possible, Reggie adored the game's potential for injecting chaos into a situation. Reggie did not want to win Dante's Diner. He wanted to win it with style. Short of that, making Pats sweat to find some ridiculous rule forbidding Reggie from making a play was success enough. Millie thought the game was fine. The time the game spent on the table was time she could sit between her two best friends. Pats would have his pile of instruction books open and ready next to the perfect lines of cards prepared for the next play. Reggie would be pushed back from the table, one hand lazy at the end of an arm thrown over the chair back, the other hand holding a fan of cards. Millie wasn't sure where Reggie kept the hat he wore just for this game, but admired how he pulled it perfectly low over his eyebrows to suggest he was a poker player at an Old West saloon coming up with some master play. If only Old West saloon players wore baseball caps that had a baby raccoon and said aspiring trash panda. The setup began. Out of the massive box came trays of tiles, each distributed around to the players. Squares that showed tables and counters and cooking areas that made up a greasy restaurant. They had names like the counterfeiter for the front counter sections, the patables with a P for the booths, and Satan's throne for the bathrooms. Then out came the cards, one deck full of the evil and cursed diners who would soon have to be fed, one much larger deck for the actions. These included the cards for ordering, cooking, and serving food. Mixed into this pile were the truly fun cards for delivering punishment on the diners or committing treachery against other players. Then there were bags and bags of various colored tokens. To keep it fair and avoid the argument again, it was a standing rule that there was no single dealer. Each player would deal one of the decks. Reggie handed out all the tiles. Pats dealt a dozen creature cards to each player. Millie dealt the action cards and put the rest as a draw pile. And, as usual, the opponents took their standard positions. Pats sat at one end of the table, ready to reference rules buried in the library of instructions that came with the game. Reggie sat opposite, reclining in a chair, his cards and tiles in a messy pile, ready to be unleashed from whatever strange order they existed. Millie sat between the two on the long side of the table, organized but relaxed, in a happy medium between the extremes of Pat's order and Reggie's chaos. They flipped out tiles for a dozen turns, building the diner that would eventually become the playing board. Both Pats and Reggie had to stand from their short ends of the table to reach the middle. Millie just had the field in front of her. The exercise of getting up seemed to energize Pats, and he got up less and stood leaning more. Reggie lingered in each decision on placing tiles, making Pats lean further and play faster when his turn came. The kitchen grew, the tables increased, the labyrinth of hell started looking more like a restaurant, just a very difficult one. Millie got to start the game because she drew the vestibule of hell, really the front door tile. It said, "Abandon all tips, ye who enter here." She dropped it at the long end of the food counter. A lot of her character cards were single entities, so they could get in and out faster. The cards with groups would have to move further and get to the patables. She heard Reggie grunt a little at Millie's location, and guessed he had a lot of those groups of demons. Play began and disintegrated just as quickly. Pats and Millie dropped their strongest single character cards at the counter, Cassius and Brutus. They'd be able to eat the whole game and just rack up points. Reggie tried to play a dog food card, hoping to wipe them out with Cerberus, the three-headed hound of hell. Pats reviewed the rules on Cerberus and ordered it back in the deck, because there wasn't something to eat for each of the mythic dog's 3 heads. "I'll put it back in my hand," Reggie complained. Millie noticed his thin grin at making Pats research to prevent the play. She also felt Pat's joy at doing the research. "You can't," Pats advised. "You played it just to no effect, and now we know you have it." "I don't care if you know I have it. It was just a missed rule for a weird card. You had to pull out the 5th set of instructions to find that rule." "Rule's good," Millie said, not completely paying attention to her words. Both boys turned to her, concerned. "Sorry, it was something we dealt with at work." Millie absolutely felt how strange that sentence was as it fell out of her mouth. To say she was working was still kind of weird. That there was something to be dealt with, even weirder. The adultish non-words surprised her and kind of sucked. "I don't know why I said that. Grandpa told me a story about a black hole and a magnetosphere, and it has kind of bothered me." "Like scary bothered you?" Reggie asked. He was still a little unsteady at meeting a myriade, a person that was also a hive of people. Reggie spent the week carefully avoiding anthills and saying pleasing affirmations to the bugs as he made sure not to upset them. "No, not scary. Very out of place. Like the lesson was that rules are good, and it doesn't feel like either a complete lesson or the full point Grandpa wanted to make. He operates a bookshop that violates most of the rules of space and time," Pats pointed out. It was nice that both boys knew about the shop openly now, and she didn't have to talk in code. "Right. Who is he to say that rules are good?" Millie said. She gave a long sigh and let out the stress at Grandpa's story. As her mind cleared, she looked at the game board again, differently. Millie said, "For the sake of moving the game, let's split the difference. Reggie, put dog food back in the deck and draw from the top. Then take your turn again." This was the perfect compromise, because it made neither boy happy. But both had long accepted Millie as a neutral arbiter of fair justice, and it was just as much a part of the game as Reggie's chaos and Pat's order. Together, the 3 were a diagonal on an alignment chart. Play resumed and continued long into the afternoon. Thursday morning, back in the shop, was strangely busy with customers. At least 2 people were roaming the bookshelves, and someone else was at the counter for the first few hours of the day. The bell chimed frequently. Millie and Grandpa fell into a comfortable routine of answering questions and checking out at the register. Neither sat down. Millie felt a little uneasy because she noticed the rainbow of people that were in the shop. It felt like each new customer was coming from a new planet. Being in used bookstores From the smell to the nostalgia to just the joy of physical memory, made everyone very accepting. No one questioned why the person looking at books was different race or gender or hair covered in full galactic sentry armor or translucent protoplasm with no arms or legs. It's just a bookstore. That alone primed the genial acceptance field that surrounded the shop. The persistence engine that ran the shop didn't have to do too much to push that good feeling, only translate languages. Finally, the wave slowed to a single customer, the aforementioned translucent protoplasm with no arms or legs. So the big book of tasks came out as usual. Grandpa grimaced at the first line. Millie was concerned at such an expression on Grandpa's usually welcoming and amused face. "You okay?" she asked. "Least favorite task. I have to make the staff schedule." "Grandpa, there's only 2 of us that work here." "It's still a complex document. I need to make sure that we follow different employment rules that apply in every place we do business. Plus, the movement of the shop at more than the speed of light causes some issues with time cards." "Did this month's schedule violate relativity or employment law on one or more worlds?" "No." "I'm okay if we just copy it again." There was a pause for consideration. "Perfect!" Grandpa went over to the calendar, crossed out June, and wrote July. "Done! And no employment rules violated." "Rules good," Millie announced. It still bugged her, and she wanted to ask Grandpa about it, but wasn't quite sure how. Then she thought about the thing in the employee handbook about employee schedules. There was still something itching at the back of Millie's brain about that, too. And she decided to combine the 2 itches and see if one could solve the other. "Grandpa, the employee handbook talks about the book of habits. If rules are good, should I start reading that?" "So, Quibby, habits are not rules. Also, funny story. The book of habits was kind of aspirational when I put it in the handbook." "It's in there for every section, sometimes twice." "I may not have realized how many habits there are." "That's what's aspirational about it?" Millie asked. "It's aspirational that it's anything close to a book. It's constantly evolving, being added to, and adjusting by all the new stuff we find out. Like here, our current customer is from Dinnerette. One of your predecessors made a note about it, and it's here." Grandpa pointed to a small sticky note under the glass on the counter. In blocky, clear writing, it said, "Dinnerette socks." Millie remembered that this counter was not actually a wooden surface with tax tables and small notes stuffed under a glass top, as it appeared. The whole thing was a computer display, one astoundingly clear enough to make itself look like a wooden surface with tax tables and small notes stuffed under a glass top. "What does socks mean?" Millie asked. "Steer the Dinnerette away from the theoretical propulsion section." Millie blinked. "How does theoretical propulsion connect to socks?" "Oh, that was from an acolyte named Haljan Univert. You can tell by their handwriting. The Dinnerette have soft pseudopods on a mostly tundra planet, so socks are crucial on the surface. It's a reminder that the Dinnerette emit an alluring but sometimes noxious bioluminescence when traveling. It speeds their movement over the icy, rough soil on their homeworld. Really hard to clean out of bookshelves. So socks, traveling protoplasm, theoretical propulsion. Makes sense. Millie blinked twice. I might need a translation for that too. Is there a reference like the non-existent Book of Habits about all the stories that come from where acolytes have lived? There probably should be a Book of Inhabitants too, Grandpa said, laughing. And Millie saw again where her father got his terrible pun sensibility. Can we see all the notes at once? That would come close to a Book of Habits, I suppose. I suppose, too. I don't think I ever tried it. Grandpa leaned to the side to see the dinnerette customer slide around the corner in one of the back sections, not associated with travel of any sorts. Grandpa held his finger over the note and said, Crystal, can I have all the notes? Millie wanted to ask why Grandpa said Crystal. However, very quickly, the screen counter started filling up with more notes, many brightly colored and squared, a few carved rocks, some shaped like irregularly torn pieces of paper. They kept opening, piling in the screen on top of each other. When that filled, they poured over the sides and the front of the counter, which were apparently also screens that connected to the shop's computer. The new notes did not stop at the floor, nor did the new notes stop opening. Is the whole shop a digital screen? Millie surprised herself at her breathless surprise. Everything's a screen if you stand back far enough, Grandpa said. The notes were appearing in varied forms now, some looking like thicker wood, others very computerized graphics panels, all with phrases of handwriting in groups. She was backtracking through the whole history of acolytes, following the wave of notes as they popped up and displayed. The flood had opened in countless panels across the entire main room of the shop. Thousands of notes, some with just pairs of words like dinnerette socks, that started this note-plosion. Others had whole paragraphs of detailed instructions or starting sentences of what Millie thought would make very interesting books. One had an easy question of, when does Plutz open? Another had the slightly harder question, just a disconnected why in all capital letters. It was a wave of notes breaking across the room, filling every surface, washing up the walls, and opening on parts of the ceiling. Millie left the counter and followed the opening wave towards the doors of the other rooms of the shop. She stepped in front of the wave, moving towards the doorway, trying to catch if this flipping would interrupt the customer. She wasn't sure what she'd do if it came close. Hold back the computer somehow? Become a screen herself? If it wanted, the persistence engine would fill the whole shop with notes. But it didn't. At her feet, before it got to the next room, the wave slowed and unfurled and sputtered to a stop. The last two notes flipped at her feet. They were in a very familiar handwriting, a handwriting that signed her notes to school or put small comments in the margins of her draft homework essays. They were Dad's, from way before he was Dad. One note had a small drawing that looked like a circuit cloud next to a door. Between them had a line that said, Tether. The original idea for the shop's persistence engine, Millie guessed. The other note in Dad's handwriting said, Save for stony salvia. Millie wondered about the thing the guy who became Dad had saved for the girl who became Mom. Grandpa leaned back in his chair and wore a big smile while he gave his redecorated bookshop a long, appraising look. I think we might just be people who write a lot of notes. Millie flexed her own terrible pun muscle. Or notable people. That's a good one, Quibby. Grandpa took a moment more to survey the history of his shop, now spread out in dozens of distinct writing styles and short, pithy references. Then, like he had started with the first note, which began the whole flippin' unfolding of the shop's history, he put his finger on the screen and said, Crystal, could you copy and compile these notes into a written book? Please attribute them to the person who wrote them. Millie started feeling the small size and machine noises of the persistence engine. The door made a different sound if it was tethered to her Barber Avenue Street location or one of the other 1,000 worlds they connected. It was never loud, but it was never off. Responding to Grandpa's request, the machine made a different sound. It was flipping, like the sound of Reggie's shuffling a deck of character cards. She noticed the small notes start disappearing, starting with the ones from her father, the oldest, going first. They reversed backwards, through the way they opened, uncovering the shelves and the floor and parts of the walls and ceiling. The unfluttering came back to the front counter. In the end, two things remained. There was the original note on the counter that said, Dinnerette, Socks. And there was a new book on the front shelf that said, Book of Habits. That looks like something good for us to both read, Grandpa said. Rules good. Millie felt them coming around to the second issue she was having. Oh, habits are much better than rules because they can change, Grandpa said. Habits can make us better as long as we're ready to make the habits smarter. Is there a planet where that applied? Millie asked, just a little too snarky. Grandpa looked at her sideways, then accepted the snark. Yup, all the planets that are still around. And not quadrisected because of some nearby black hole magnetosphere incident? That planet is not exactly a round planet anymore. Grandpa let the pun linger for a second too long. It's a good thing to think about. If the residents of Kainade Alant had checked their magnetosphere as a habit, they wouldn't wobble like a rotopitch and egg ball and have 6 summers each year. But they had the rule buried deep in some binder that no one ever saw. Millie didn't like the idea of the Book of Habits all of a sudden. It started feeling like the room was swinging from one end of their Dante's Diner game table to the other. With all the piles of notes out, the room was Reggie's chaos of cards. Now in a neat book, it was Pat's organized library at the other end. She saw so many times that those ends didn't let the game work. Or worse, the game wasn't fun. Does putting all this into a book make these habits just as bad as some buried binder? Millie asked. Grandpa laughed. Oh, the shop solved that problem. Look carefully at the cover. Under the simple text that said Book of Habits, the cover said Volume 1, annotated, unrevised, and wildly incomplete. This was Millie Salmon and the Book of Habits, Chapter 2, Work Schedule and Attendance. In the next episode, Millie navigates the hurdles of payday. Thank you for listening. You can find out more about Millie at milliesalmon.com or join us on Patreon. Please like, subscribe, and leave a review on whichever podcast app you use. Millie Salmon and the Book of Habits is a production of Infinite Shop Limited, which you can follow on all social media platforms. I'm Ray Dubicki. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to reading more for you soon.